Good morning and welcome to Viewpoint, your program of personalities, politicians, and perspectives. Today, happily, we'll live out the politicians because, boy, oh boy, is this country getting more and more divided. Whoa. So we'll just talk about personalities and perspectives. This morning, by the way, before I start, may I have my usual 30 seconds for kudos?
We're at 28, maybe.
Okay, all right, thank you. Well, instead of a kudo, last night I went down to the welcome home another honor flight. The boys, they flew out to Washington, D.C. to see our memorials out there. And there were 44 wheelchairs on that airplane.
Is that right?
That, we've come to that now. There are 44 wheelchairs. And so it was a little late getting home, so the old fella didn't get in bed till midnight. And so if I just kind of doze off, you'll pick up the slack.
I'll just give you an elbow.
Instead of a kudo, I wanted to tell you about this thing that happened to me yesterday. A guy came up to me, and of course I had a blue Land Lincoln Honor Flight shirt on and a cap, and he tapped me on the shoulder and he handed me this card. And the card says, now this man went out and had these cards prepared on his own dime. Thank you for your service and dedication to our country. And on the reverse side it says, Dear American Hero, which I am not. I am not certain as to how to express my gratitude for all you've done to secure my freedom. Please accept this simple card as a small token of appreciation. A grateful American citizen.
Well, isn't that a nice thing?
Well, it was. And I got up out of my chair and followed him and tapped him on the shoulder and shook hands with him and thanked him for the gesture.
Yes.
The meaning of the gesture, that he would take that. Well, number one, he had these cards prepared at his own expense, and he just randomly hands them out to veterans.
Well, bless his heart.
Oh, God love him. You betcha.
See, let's just always remember to focus on those kinds of people rather than, for instance, Washington, D.C., who's choosing up sides to spit at the crack there.
Well,
I tell you, let's just not concentrate on them.
Those dudes are like concrete masons. They put a chisel in the crack and keep hammering away at it, and finally it's going to break. This country's in terrible shape with the divisions that we're about to undergo and undergoing now. Oh, let's get serious here. Why don't you introduce our guest?
Yes. Speaking of nice people.
Yes, very nice.
Yes. We met Dr. Donna Bradley at the Mid-Autumn program over at Lincoln College. Dr. Bradley teaches there. She teaches criminal justice, and she knows a lot about it because she was telling me she's the third generation of college graduates in her family. And the generation before that would be your great-great-grandfather, was a slave. How interesting. And now here you are working on your 6th degree. She graduated from college first as an attorney.
Okay.
Then she went into the ministry. Then she went into the teaching of
profession
of justice classes. You've not been bored, have you, Dr.
You know why
Bradley?
she gave up on the ministry?
Why?
She came across a guy like me and she says, boy, that's no help there. Well, what intrigued me after meeting Dr. Bradley is that her track to her present degree, which is a doctorate, I'd like to kind of go along the ladder of how you achieve each degree, because it showed to me a tremendous amount of I guess
tenacity.
Tenacity is the word. Thank you. I knew you were more than a pretty face. She came up with the right word. Thank you. So let's go back as take it from the top, or in this case, the bottom, Doctor.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. My family always stressed education. My mom was a teacher. My father was a postal worker. He went to college for a couple of years, but my parents always stressed the value of education. As you mentioned, Judy, my grandfather had a degree from Benedict College. My mother had a degree from Lemoyne-Owen College in Memphis. And so it was never an option. I felt that I never had an option.
You were going to get a degree of some sort.
I was going to go to college.
Uh-huh.
So my mother, in 1968 in Memphis, which was the same year Martin Luther King was assassinated, sent me to a school, St. Mary's Episcopal School, a girls' school. And at the time I was 12, I had no idea the historical impact of my mother's decision. But St. Mary's had never had an African-American student. And so I went there, and of course, 1968 Memphis was pretty tense.
Oh, yeah.
And so there was some tension at the school. Some parents pulled their kids out of the school because I came. And there were 42 girls in the class, and some of them didn't like me just because their friends left when I came. So it was a very tough experience, but as a 12-year-old child, I didn't fully understand what was going on. When I was born, Jim Crow was the law, so I was 8 when the Civil Rights Act passed, and schools were supposed to desegregate. But at that time in Memphis, a lot of Christian schools popped up to keep their kids from going to school with people like me.
Sure.
And so at St. Mary's, though, I will say this. Not only did I get an excellent college preparatory education, over the years, I made some friends. So even though my high school experience was very different from the rest of my classmates, we agreed in a conference call, actually. They were talking about the trips to Aspen during spring break and the horseback riding and the slumber parties. And I'm like, what high school did y'all go to? Because I don't remember any of that. Yeah. And there was silence. And many of them said, my parents wouldn't let me invite you to my house. They were afraid what the neighbors would say. Or I never realized that, you even wanted to come. And so after that phone call, we decided, there were tears, there was forgiveness. We're going to go forward from here and develop new friendships, and we did that. And over the years, I've gotten to know these ladies as adults. And in fact, I had a son that passed away 10 years ago. And I was unable to get life insurance on him because he had cerebral palsy. They paid for his funeral.
Really?
So that was my high school. Those were my high school years. They were pretty tough. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I really realized the impact of me attending St. Mary's. St. Mary's is now about 30% black and brown. And that excites me, and that is my reward. In 2018, they named me Alumni of the Year, which was also a privilege. So from St. Mary's, I thought I would take a gap year. I told my parents I wanted to take a gap year, and they asked me had I lost my mind. And so I went to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, earned a bachelor's in political science. And from there to Howard University in Washington, D.C., School of Law, where I earned a Juris Doctorate degree. My first job as an attorney, I was making $18,000. I thought I was rich. And I worked for Defense Logistics Agency in Northern California. Between moving back to Memphis and being in California, I was a rape crisis advocate and eventually director of a sexual assault center, and worked with victims of sexual assault, was a liaison between them and the criminal justice system. And that was when I first learned that the criminal justice system doesn't exactly work the way the books say that it does. So that was a little disillusioning. Because law school doesn't teach you how to practice law, it just teaches you about the law. And when you see practice in action, it's often different from the concepts that you learn. So moved back to Memphis and practiced labor and employment law with the National Labor Relations Board. When I moved to St. Louis is when I started to work in the inner city ministry. And again, my interest in criminal justice peaked. I shared with Judy earlier, that's because I saw a difference in a disparity in sentencing between the city of St. Louis and the county of St. Louis. You could have two people that committed the same crime in the same way, and they received very different sentences. And I wanted to understand that. So after 35 years, do y'all know I went back to school?
And at what point in time, Doctor, did you work towards your doctorate?
Well, when I went back to school.
Along this period of time right now?
It's about that time, 35 years later, I went back to school and got a master's degree in criminal justice from Columbia College, and loved it so much. I loved learning so much that I decided to continue to pursue the doctorate. And so I went straight from the master's degree to the doctoral program. And my dissertation was comparing police performance in union and non-union municipal departments. Kind of mixed the labor relations with the criminal law.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
it took you a long time to prepare your thesis on that. You put a lot of time in working on that, I'm certain.
It took about 2 years to finish the research and the writing, yes.
You said you were curious when you moved to St. Louis how sentencing within the city of St. Louis could be so different for the same crime as it was in the county of St. Louis. Did you ever get an answer to that question you were pondering? Because it's a very good question.
It's such an easy but sad answer. It's racial disparity in sentencing, and it's just common. We could get into criminal justice policies that resulted in mass incarceration of black and brown people. So we moved from a system of Jim Crow, which was the legalized segregation, to a system of mass incarceration where the laws and the policies resulted in mass incarceration of black and brown people. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, referred to it as the New Jim Crow because, well, first of all, the United States incarcerates more of its own citizens than any country in the world. Let's let that sink in for a minute. Why do we incarcerate so many of our own citizens? And it was really the war on drugs and the drug policies that resulted in mass incarceration. You could get 100 times the sentence for crack cocaine than you could get for powder cocaine, and they're essentially the same substance. So
I'd like to point out to our listeners that Dr. Bradley speaks of a time about which none of us who are not black or not minorities can really relate to. It's just something that's out there that we read about and know about. But folks in your category, you walk the line,
yes, sir.
as Johnny Cash used to say. But we can't really relate to the things that were of prime importance to you as you were a young child in school, going into a private school and being segregated there, whether you knew it or not.
Right.
And most of those kids couldn't spell segregation, let alone.
Very isolated and alone, yeah.
Unless you've walked the line, we really can't understand where you're coming from.
And Bill, you know, it's so important. This is why it's so important that we pass the history on to our kids, because our kids and our kids' kids were never born into a segregated society. And so if we don't explain to them what it took for them to be able to go where they want and eat where they want and sleep where they want, if we don't explain it to them, they'll take it for granted. So my mother was very active in the civil rights movement in Memphis, which is why she sent me to that school.
Sure.
My dad used to keep a bail fund because if the sign said white, that's the door my mother was going in. And so if the water fountain said white, she was going to drink that water.
So he tapped that bail fund pretty often.
He'd
then.
keep that bail fund because she would get arrested.
That's interesting.
Because she was civilly disobedient. Technically, that was the law, but she disagreed with the law, and she wasn't afraid to show it. So it was people like my mother and those that she worked with and picketed with, and they laid the way for us. And it's important that every generation knows that so that we don't take it for granted. And so I make sure that my kids are registered to vote. My kids are adults, so I should stop referring to them as kids, probably.
They're still your kids. Yeah.
That is true. But I made sure they understood the significance of registering to vote because there was a time when they couldn't. And actually, it's been in my lifetime that African Americans have been able to vote. And so even now, as we speak, there's some policies being promoted that would even quash that ability, some of the voter suppression policies right now.
And speaking of voting, I'm going to go out on a campaign right now for our sponsors. Mr. Ash has sponsors lined up so that these people can hear people like you with interesting stories. So go right ahead, Mr. Ash. Right back live in the studio here, the program is Viewpoint. Our guest this morning, Judy Busby and myself, found a lady, very interesting background, and a lady who lived a life of pursuing education, perhaps not primarily, but perhaps substantially through the efforts of her mother, who was determined that her child was going to get a good education. And now we find that she's on the side. She's on the other side of education. She's teaching our youngsters here at Lincoln College, in courses of criminal justice and law enforcement, which is where our grandson, I should better include Gene there. Our grandson graduated from Lincoln College, and now he's doing something entirely different, not related to his education at all, but it's a very big thing. I use the term he sells body parts. Well, he works for a firm who sells prostheses, and in the process thereof, he goes right into the surgical theater and stands next to the doctor, and they talk about the patient and whatever they're going to put in the patient. So I'm pretty proud of him. But he was a graduate of the criminal justice law enforcement program at Lincoln College, and our good friend Gary Joe Baker, Donna's predecessor as a teacher there, he certainly had a big impact on a lot of kids out there.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. I know that because when I'm on campus, which is rather frequently, I always ask some of the kids as I see them, who's some of your favorite instructors? And Gary Baker's name always came up. And now we're going to have Donna Bradley's name keep popping up because of her interest in making sure that our kids leave that campus with a good education. When did you come aboard with us at Lincoln College, Doctor?
I started at Lincoln in July.
In
July this year.
When you teach your students, what do you tell them about justice? That's the most important thing.
We have a lot of discussions about what is justice because
Fair enough.
There's differing perspectives on what justice is. And so there's a couple of models that we talk about. One is the crime control model, which is the get tough on crime perspective, and at any cost, incarcerate, apprehend, arrest, incarcerate. That's the crime control perspective. Then there's the due process model, which focuses on individual rights. We want to make sure individuals are protected as they navigate the criminal justice system. And so there really needs to be a balance of the two. But for the most part, people fall on one side or the other.
Yes, I can understand that. And you know, when somebody does some heinous crime, you wonder if if they deserve, there's a word for you, justice.
You know what, Judy? What I've come to learn over the years about our justice system is because of the focus on crime control and due process, that oftentimes when a person is acquitted or found not guilty, it's not because they didn't do it, it's because the prosecutor was unable to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And then, so there's sometimes innocent people convicted and sometimes guilty people are let go in our system, because at the end of the day, the juries are made up of people like us who grew up in different environments, were taught different values, have different perspectives, and sometimes we consider factors other than the law and the facts, just because our perspectives vary.
We were talking on the way up here about values and the things that you learn at your mother's knee that can't be taught in any college, can they?
That's true. That's true. Integrity and honesty and work ethic, those values.
Those, if you have those in abundance, or if you have a smattering of them, and a desire, you'll succeed. But without integrity and without work ethics, you're not going anywhere.
I agree. Sometimes you go somewhere for a season, but it catches up. As my grandmother used to say, if it doesn't come out in the wash, it's coming out in the rinse.
Doctor, do your kids in class ever ask you about capital punishment? Does that subject matter ever come up?
Yes, capital punishment does come up, and of course, like everything else, there's varying perspectives on that. And we talk about, I want them to have opinions, but I want them to support their opinions with the research. I tell them, you sound so intelligent when you can say what the research says. And so research has shown that the death penalty is not a deterrent to crime. And also with our system being flawed, it's not a perfect justice system. If one innocent person is killed, for me, it's too many. But there's different perspectives on whether the death penalty is right or wrong. I don't believe we have the death penalty in Illinois for that very reason.
No. But, having heard what you just said about whether you like it or not, it seems to me that certain crimes call for capital punishment. I'm speaking now of heinous crimes which people commit, and that could be by whose definition, what's heinous.
Right.
So, but it seems to me that we're pretty lax in that, and we've got some scoundrels cop off with
The Supreme Court just decided a case not long ago this year where there was a man that was tried 6 times for quadruple murder. The murder occurred in 1996, and they kept trying, and the juries kept hanging. There were hung juries, so they just kept prosecuting him, and he appealed all the way to the Supreme Court on a procedural error, and the error that he asserted was that there was racial discrimination in jury selection, and the Supreme Court agreed that there was. 7-2. It was a 7-2 Supreme Court decision, and that was just this year.
Boy, how would you go about determining that jury selection can be a prejudicial matter? That's kind of out there in the Netherlands somewhere.
Well, sometimes there's a pattern of excluding jurors of a particular race, and that is sometimes the evidence that supports that type of assertion.
But there are some people, few and far between, thank God, who have no redeeming social value. And you can try them 7 times and not reach any conclusions, but they're never going to be a productive citizen. They just don't have the things we were talking about, like integrity.
And do you think What do you think causes that? Do you think it's mental illness, or do you think that it's how they were raised,
All of the above, but now they're focusing more lately, I think, on your mental health. They seem to be connecting all sorts of problems with, but the beginning of it all is that this person isn't well emotionally.
And you know what?
Why did she look at me that way, Jim? She said, looked right down my throat when she said, no redeeming value.
That's another way the prisons have populated, is the criminalization of mental illness and the criminalization of homelessness and the criminalization of addiction.
Yes.
So when addiction became a crime, lots of people were locked up. And mental illness, sometimes, if we don't understand it, it looks like criminal behavior when it's not. And homelessness, a lot of homeless people incarcerated. And so lots of nonviolent drug offenders. And Judy pointed out to me the marijuana grow area on the way here.
Yes.
And I thought, there are lots of people incarcerated now for nonviolent drug offenses. But in January, we're going to allow people to participate in the same activity that some people are currently incarcerated for.
How do you remedy a situation like that when the rules change?
I wish I had the answer.
You're asking her to legislate now. She's not a
I wish I had
legislator.
the answers, but I would certainly say consider releasing some of those people since the rules change. That would be my proposed solution. But
The solution to drugs on the street, of course, it's money. That's what it's all about. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
But if you can catch the people who are putting this stuff out there to make people addicts and make people sick, those are the people we need to get to and put them away for a long time.
there are actually some states that have begun to charge the drug dealers when someone overdoses.
Yeah. Well, that seems reasonable. So
But
this-
usually they're rather anonymous. How do you charge them?
Oh, they're not so anonymous.
Well, I suppose to their
People on the
clientele.
street know who they are.
Yeah.
Judy and I sit here and so engrossed in what we're talking with Dr. Bradley that I didn't even give her the courtesy of announcing the number. Somebody might have a question of Dr. Donna Bradley, professor of criminal justice and law enforcement at Lincoln College, and a lady who's grown up through the educational field, determined, and I use that word advisedly, determined to get an education, probably in a great measure pushed by her parents. So 648-5510. Anybody have any questions, comments, be nice to her. She's a pretty nice lady. So
I forgot to-
648-5510. Go right ahead, y'all.
I forgot to tell you that I'm still in school.
Yes. Oh,
Yes.
I'm currently working on a doctorate in education
Doctor in education.
with a higher education administration focus.
Oh, she hasn't quit.
I love learning. Love learning.
You're an inspiration to you ought to inspire those kids that go to your classes to do better. And I'm sure she has in some cases down there.
Do you have sisters and brothers?
I have a sister who she actually followed in my footsteps. She went to St. Mary's, then she went to Brown University, and then she went to Howard for law school as well.
That's interesting.
So your family is education bound.
Absolutely. My cousins, lots of cousins have degrees, uncles have degrees. I have two uncles that taught at the University of Arkansas in Pine Bluff. I have an uncle that was a elementary school principal. Education is very important in my family. All of my mother and all her brothers had degrees, and on my father's side, they were mostly police officers. Was one of my uncles, elementary school principal. My dad worked at the post office, and so they they weren't as focused on education, but they were focused on supporting their families and
Yes.
taking care of their families.
Well, your extended family certainly is an attribute to any place you choose to live. How do you think you are all this way? Which generation did it come from?
I think it goes as far back as my grandfather, for sure. As you mentioned, Judy, in our conversation, my great-grandparents were slaves and then sharecroppers. And they were determined that their kids were going to have more than they did. And each generation wanted more for their kids. And so my grandfather, as I mentioned, he was a World War I veteran. And he got a degree from Benedict College, and then he retired from the Veterans Administration. He worked there until he retired as a clerk. And so he sent his kids to college. I remember the story my granddaddy said. My mother and father were junior high school sweethearts, and when they graduated from high school, he asked my grandfather if he could marry my mom, and my grandfather said, absolutely not. She's going to college. Come see me in 4 years.
Is that right?
And that's just the way it was.
That's the way it was. And sure enough, my dad went back in 4 years. And in 1954, my parents were married. And they were married till death. So that was they were my role models. Unfortunately, it didn't work out like that for me, but that was what I saw growing up, was a very stable family environment with a focus on education and
But you use the words, and they're so important: stable family environment. And without that as a mantle, so to speak, over a kid, it's pretty hard for them to advance. And everywhere that brings us our street problems today. Kids growing up without the family's environment that was stable.
I think it's fun to hear you talk about your family down through the years, because you knew who was running it, didn't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, there was no, I bet there was no back talking.
Oh, no.
Or asking things like, why me, to
But
your
anyway,
parents.
anybody was
You
smart
did
enough
what
to-
you were told.
Anybody
what
smart
you were
enough to
told.
set aside bail money because he knew it was coming. That's a pretty wise dude.
Yeah, my family, my parents instilled a lot of what I consider positive values and lots of motivation in me. And at the time, I didn't appreciate it because I was a kid.
Yeah.
And, we don't become smart until our kids become adults, right?
Exactly.
And my kids, I'm very proud of them. My youngest son is an IT manager at an architectural firm in the Kansas City area. I'm very proud of him. His degree is in management information systems. And my middle son passed away 10 years ago.
He was awful young.
He was 27 years old. He was
Oofda.
27 years old. But he had cerebral palsy and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So he had a lot of issues going on.
Bless his heart.
And then my son, my third son, works in IT at Walgreens corporate headquarters. So
Respect was a big thing in your family, wasn't it?
absolutely. Absolutely. And there were simply things you did not say to adults back then.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't even ask questions back then. You just did what you were told.
That's
and
right.
so our kids were able to ask questions. And so that old just because I said so doesn't really fly anymore. But that was what we got. If you asked a question, it was because I said so.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, and you didn't question that.
No.
No.
But I never minded explaining my rules to my kids, because I used to hate when they told me because I said so. Even though later, you understand it. I remember about 30, the light bulb went off, and I believe that's when my kids said, "Ma, I get you," when they were about 30 and had their own kids.
Mine, we're talking the other day about when they were little, because we'd gone someplace and there was a young mother with 2 little kids, like say 4 and 5, and the 4-year-old was a real Hanyak. And I was telling the kids about that, and they said that they remembered so well when I used to say to them, grab their arm rather strongly and say, would you like to go to the bathroom? Which is where you spoke to them by hand, you know.
Right. But do you remember the look? My parents could just give me a look, and I knew right away. They didn't have to say a word. It was just a look.
But you know what the bottom line is on that? Respect.
Respect, that is.
Do you think that's waning a little bit in our society?
I know that it has. I know that it.
You know what's responsible for a lot of that?
What?
TV and the media and the movies that they put out.
And the breakdown the family structure.
Break down the family structure, exactly. Where it was once all important, today it's not that important, and it should be as important today as right from the get-go.
I worry about that respect business, respect for within families and respect within society.
Within people. Exactly.
It's just all about me.
Right.
I'm number one.
Right.
Off air, we talked about Lincoln being a small community, and you asked if we had many black people in the community. No, it was a very small population, but 99% of them were over and above well respected, and they were treated with the same respect as anybody else, any white guy that walked into your house. We had folks like Reverend Clarence Long and Minor Hill, who worked for the Hills next door to us back there on Peoria Street. Solid people. And I think of my young friend Alfred Orndorff today, came from a solid background, and that's why he succeeded, because that was the mantra under which he grew up.
The way you're raised has so much to do with who you are, doesn't it?
It affects so much of who we are, even as adults.
Definitely.
And some of those values that we talked about, Judy, integrity and honesty and work ethic, those types of values, I think they have to begin when you're a kid, and it's something you have to embrace, so that if you do anything else, it's against your grain. But those values are so very important in shaping who we become as adults.
And I think we should throw respect into those values too. That's so important. I don't know whether we respected or feared, like my dad. You know, we knew he brought us into the world and he could take us out.
I think we've all heard that before.
His most famous comment was, Judy, don't you repeat it so you get it right about
No.
Open your mouth and prove it.
People think you're stupid. Open your mouth and prove it. My dad was what you'd call a real builder of personal strength. He thought humility was well worn by people.
Dr. Bradley, your students in your current classes, are they an interested group, or you think some of them are just taken so they can get 3 hours credit?
There are a variety of reasons why people go to college, and honestly, when I was 18, I wanted that gap year. My parents wouldn't give it to me. But a lot of kids are just not prepared, and I'm talking about everywhere for college at 18. They're just not ready. And I've taught at Maryville University, St. Charles Community College, Columbia College, Lindenwood University, Lincoln College, and it's the same everywhere. Young kids are not necessarily well prepared to be away from home and to be focused enough to know what they want in life. And I was the same way. When I left home to go to college, or I should say when my parents took me to college and stayed 3 months. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And in fact, had I known then what I know now in terms of what interests me and what my passions are, then I would have waited and focused on that area. My passion is teaching. I love teaching, and I've learned that your passion is that which you would do for free. What would you do for free? That's your passion. Now, don't tell anybody I would do it for free.
I'm going to rush. I'm going to go rush back, hurry back there and talk to the main office up there. Do you know Donna Bradley worked for us for nothing? The fact that you were so determined to be educated spills over into the fact that you have to be a good educator. And I'd like to monitor a class or two with sitting in the back row, listening to the doctor, because here's a lady of faith, very obviously, and a lady who is passionate about what she does, passionate about how she got to where she is, which is certainly more than understandable. Any little snippets before we close out this hour, Dr. Bradley?
No, just thank you guys for having me and for allowing me to share my story.
Bless your heart. Thank you so much for coming.
Dr. Donna Bradley, instructor at Criminal Justice Law Enforcement at Lincoln College. And I'm sure glad we bumped into the other day. We wouldn't have had the privilege of having you up here this morning. Thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you.